So, um, a very warm welcome to everyone who has joined in the student space, and thank you so much for tuning in. This is the first Twitter space of Kubesimplify. We have been planning to start the Twitter spaces from last couple of weeks, and I have finally stepped into it. Let me break down to you what is Kubesimplify. Uh, so Kubesimplify is a community started by Sayum Pathak uh, that aims at simplifying the cloud native learning curve for everyone. It is a community for everyone, including students as well as professionals. Uh, Many folks have might come across various blogs by Chrome Simplify, but we are not only limited to blogs. There are several other things which we have stepped into, like mini projects. Just go on GitHub, search for Cube Simplify, and you will see a couple of projects which you can get started with. Also, we have so many awesome folks. So do join our Discord community and get involved. Um, Now, let me hand over back to Apoorv. So Apoorv, let's hear out your introduction.
Yeah, so hello everyone. This is Apoorv Goyal, and I've been a software engineer since the past 4 years, and have worked remotely. Like I've been working remotely since before COVID, and I've been working remotely like ever since I started coding. So I haven't done an in-office job till date. And over my years, I've worked in a lot of startups and companies and teams across the world. Some of the most prominent ones out of them has been Airbnb and Duolingo, that like I pride myself upon. And in my tenure, I've done web development, majorly done web development, but I'm not limited to web development. Apart from that, I've also like done some DevOps, like things like Docker and setting up the infrastructure, and I've also like done some bit of mobile development as well as data science and machine learning. And yeah, blockchain interests me, and yeah, I think that's pretty much it. As for tech stack, I mean, I don't have a tech stack as such. I'm comfortable working with any technology that is there.
Wonderful. So before we just jump into the topic, let me just clarify that you all might see pinned tweet in the space. So I will be dropping all the relevant links in the comment section of that tweet. So do keep checking it out for the links. So now let's jump into the topic. So uh, a little bit introduction from you, Apu, on what is Linux, and I have come across this question many a time that some developers say that Linux is a kernel, and some have some other perspective like it is a operating system. So, what's your call on it?
So Linux-based operating systems are majorly based out on Linux-based kernel, which was developed in 1991 by Linus Torvalds. And this Linux kernel is like under the GNU, licensing system that is there. So I mean, there are a lot of other components that are there along with the Linux kernel, and like combining all these components with slight modification leads us to Linux operating system. So like a lot of people ask me the same question, like is Linux an operating system or a kernel? So Linux operating systems are comprised of the Linux kernel, but they like all have the since they all have the same kernel, then I would like to say that Linux is just kernel and not an operating system. And all the Linux based operating systems use that kernel. And yeah, I mean, all these operating systems, they might have slight modifications behind the scenes. Like there are different distributions of Linux that are available. Debian, Ubuntu, Mint OS, and all of those distributions that are there, Arch Linux. So all of these distributions have slight modifications behind the scenes. Some of them don't even have GUI components associated with them, but these slight modifications could be in terms of the kernel or some other components that the operating system uses to function. But majorly, I mean, it's just a kernel, the Linux. And kernel is like responsible for, you know, like for having the processes that the Linux operating system runs, interact with the hardware that is there. So it manages the hardware.
Yeah, couldn't agree more on this point. And also, I would like to say, if you have any questions related to Linux, just drop the questions in the comment, or just ask for request for speaker. I'll just let you in, and then you can ask your questions. We have another speaker with us, Bhavya. She will be also asking some questions from group. So let's hear out from Bhavya.
Hey Apoorv,
Yeah,
so
hi, Bhavya.
that's very interesting about Linux. Like, yeah, that you said that about kernel thing and that operating system. It's very interesting. So, would you like to share with us that as a window user, which one is best for use? Like using WSL, we can see that because I guess this is the query of many window users, like who are just hopped into the world of tech or just are thinking to hopping into the world of Linux. So, which one is
Um,
best?
Really sorry, Bhavya, but we had a voice break. Can you just fix it or just repeat it again?
Okay, so now it's okay.
Yes.
Now
Yeah,
I'm audible.
yeah, yeah. You're audible now.
Uh, so, Apoorv, that's very interesting about Linux. So, I just want to ask that would you like to share with all of us that as a window user, which one is best for use, like using WSL or we can say just dual boot our system? Because I guess this is the query of many window users who are just hopped into the world of tech or just thinking of hopping into the world of Linux. So, what are your views on this thing?
Okay, so like as a beginner's point of view, what I'd say is that Linux, like any Linux operating system, has two components to it. One is like the CLI based component that is there, and one is the GUI based component that is there, which makes it a little bit easier for us to use, coming from a Windows background, right? So if you like generally notice, even when we talk about things like Docker, and when we talk about things like AWS, they also have these operating systems. We can choose out of them whatever operating systems, virtual machine do we need on the server inside Docker or in AWS, and they are completely based out on CLI based. I mean, they don't have a GUI component associated to them. So when we talk about WSL and dual boot, the major difference between WSL and dual boot is that WSL does not comes with a GUI component, and it just installs the CLI version of that Linux based operating system into your device, into your Windows machine, and provides you with the entire file system of it. But Linux on the other, like the dual boot on the other hand, provides you with the entire thing, like the GUI as well as CLI based components. So it kind of depends on the specifications of your machine. I would say that if you have a minimum of 8 GB RAM in your system, then definitely go for dual boot, because and this is a major misconception between a lot of beginners, that if let's say I have 8 GB in my system and I dual boot my system with allocating 4 GB RAM into the virtual machine that I'm creating, then will I be only left with 4 GB? The answer is yes, you would be left with only 4 GB, but only when you're running the virtual machine. If you, let's say, close the virtual machine, then the entire 8 GB RAM would be available to your Windows system. So it's not like you're losing out on anything. You would be losing out on the hard disk space that you would be allocating to that virtual machine. That won't be available in your system. But apart from that, the RAM that you dedicate, the memory and things like that, all of that would be available when the virtual machine is not running, right? And in that sense, I would suggest that you go with dual boot, because it offers you with the GUI as well. And I mean, it would become a lot easier for you to you know code inside of it and remain in the entire file system of o- like the Linux itself, rather than getting into the file system of um, Windows. Because when you use WSL, then most of the things that you save are only getting saved in Windows. But the thing is that it is in some way structured as a Linux file system. It's not entirely a Linux file system, right? So all of these things are going to be there. So as beginners, if you are starting out, go with the dual boot. But if let's say your system does not have a minimum config of 8 GB RAM, and if there might be that you have some hard space issues, like you don't have enough space in your hard disk or things like that, in those scenarios you can go with WSL, but then you should only use WSL to make sure that you're just practicing the Linux commands and not using it, like actually using it for things like, you know doing some coding or writing some code into it and things like that. So that is there.
Yeah, that's very interesting. But it's like I just heard the many, I guess, misconceptions. Or I don't know about this. Like dual boot decreases our system speed. So is it true? Like when we dual boot our system, so our system speed is going to decrease, or is the like it's like same?
So it again comes down to the hardware resources that you have. So I mean, when you dual boot your system, your Linux is going to occupy some of the hardware space into, it's going to allocate some of your hardware. It's going to split your hardware configuration or your specifications into two different operating systems. Your Windows is also utilizing it, and Windows is running a lot of processes in the background, and your Linux is also utilizing these resources that are there. So that's why it is said that your system works at kind of half the capacity of what it can naturally, right? So that's one disadvantage. But again, if you have like a minimum specification of 8 GB RAM and 500 GB SSD, then easily you can allocate about 100 GB of hard disk into your operating system, Ubuntu operating system, or any other Linux distribution, and you can allocate half of the memory into it, like 4 GB out of it or more than that. And yeah, I mean, the space is the performance is going to be affected, since I mean, not the entire resource is getting allocated to that operating system, but still, I mean, it kind of depends on what specifications you have.
Okay. So thanks, Apoorv. And yes, today itself I'm just going to dual boot my system because I was using WSL. So that's very interesting and insightful. Thank you.
This sounds a very tough task for Windows users. Never experienced this. Then let's jump into some fun question from this, explanation, wonderful explanation. Apoorv. So, what do you recommend, Apoorv? A person should use a Mac or a Windows?
uh, I would recommend between Mac and Windows, are you asking?
Yeah.
I would recommend MacBook, not Windows.
Uh, okay. This sounds,
Yeah, so
chemical.
yeah, I mean, the basic like reasoning behind that is that Mac OS is also like based, like it's a Unix based system, right? So Unix was the first operating system that was created, but Unix had a lot of complications behind it. I mean, uh, Unix was there, but I mean, it wasn't like, as it was very restrictive in a sense that there were not a lot of modifications that could be done to it, or use the same thing in multiple use cases and things like that. So that's when different experimentations started coming up, and a new so UC Berkeley, which is there, the Berkeley University in California, they came up with this free BSD licensing, and the free BSD uh, system. BSD is like the software distribution from Berkeley, right? And they came up with this, and they developed this Unix like system which was better than it, and it was less restrictive in the sense. And then later on, Linus Torvald also developed the Linux kernel under the GNU licensing. And GNU is like, GNU is not Unix, the full form of it. But they came up with these different distributions. So all the Linux operating systems that are coming nowadays follow that Linux kernel, which are Unix like, but they are not Unix. And the Mac OS, on the other hand, follows this BSD software. It is based out, the operating system is based out on BSD, free BSD. And it also is again Unix based. So in a sense, Linux and Mac OS are very relatable to each other. Most of the commands that you run on Linux are also going to work on Mac OS. They might have a different file structure, I would say. The file system is not the same, exactly the same, but there are a lot of things that work in a very similar way between them. On the other hand, Windows has been derived from a lot of operating systems. It's not like it is derived from just one place. It has some Unix based components to it behind the scenes, but majorly it doesn't follows, it's not as um, open and free to use, as you would say. So that is the reason why Mac, is what closely resembles any Linux based operating system. And I mean, if you can afford it, because MacBooks are obviously very expensive, so if you can afford it, go with a Mac. And if not, then just go with Linux. But Windows is not something that is usually recommended at a beginner stage. Obviously there are some tools and softwares that work seamlessly on Windows. I'm not saying that they don't work, but it's better that you get started with Linux or Mac first, and then later on it's up to you if you want to switch back to Windows and things, stuff like that. But at the beginner phase, it is very important to get started with Linux, because Linux has a lot of things that resembles what we do at a much higher level. So if, let's say, we are building any software like a web application or anything like that, then we need to configure some environment variables into that, right? And Linux by default also has some environment variables. So just having the knowledge of how environment variables work in Linux also gives us uh, an upper hand or an edge when we learn about the same environment variables in any web application or something like that, right? So that is the reason why getting started with Linux is very important as compared to sticking to Windows at the very beginning phase. And now also there's one more advantage that I see to it, is that using Linux, getting starting with Linux kind of also pushes you out of your comfort zone. Because I mean, we all are from a generation where we have seen Windows and all the household systems that are there. Any laptop or computer that we had as a kid was based out on Windows, right, for most of us. So it's kind of like a comfort zone for us being able to use Windows. But when we talk about using Ubuntu or any other Linux distribution, it's kind of something that is not in our comfort zone, because so many things are happening inside that operating system that we have to do through command line and stuff, right? So it also helps us push our comfort zone, get out of it. Right. And getting out of your comfort zone is again one of the most important things when you're trying to become a software developer, because most of the times things are not going to work the way you want them to.
Yeah, exactly. The point which you mentioned that during our generation when we used to work on Windows, the complete computer to me was just have a window, play games, and then just shut it down. And I experience this thing now a lot, that after I switched to Mac, I see that it is very development friendly, if I may say. And I have my all friends cursing me that you have Mac, it's faster and all. But yeah, couldn't agree more on this point. So um, now I have seen codes by you as well on Linux. I would love to see some insights from the course. Is it beginner friendly, or is it for everyone? And something more if you want to tell about the course.
Are you talking about my course on Linux?
Yeah, yeah, your YouTube channel course.
Yeah, so it's completely beginner friendly, but the thing is that I've like taken a very deep dive into Linux. It's not like the regular Linux courses that are out there, because most of the Linux courses that are out there just scratch the surface. They just talk about some of the basic commands that are there and what they do, but how these commands work behind the scenes, or what is happening behind the scenes, how different processes work in Linux, and how a system boots up, what happens when a system boots up, and how different there are different protocols for each and everything in Linux, because Linux operating system in itself is a software, right? So most of the tutorials only talk about how to use the software. In my course, I have talked about how the software works behind the scenes, right? So it is obviously very in depth, but on the other hand, it could deem like something that is not going to be used in your life. But that's not the case, because if, let's say, in future, in some other, like some point of time from now, if you want to you know get into operating systems, or operating systems is something that interests you, then obviously it is going to help a lot. If you are into networking, then also it is going to help a lot. And especially if you are pursuing to go into DevOps, Like if you're pursuing to become a DevOps engineer, then this course is a must, because the kind of things that it talks about is something that you are going to, see very often as you progress in your career in future, right? So these things, having the knowledge of it, is going to make it much easier for you to understand how, different things work. It's going to help you understand how the Linux like operating system is architected, right? And it is also going to, open a lot of scope for you, in the sense that you are going to become very creative after this. Creative in the sense that how, you can solve different problems, because when we talk about how Linux works, then there are a lot of problems, and all of these problems have some solutions implemented behind the scenes, right? So we are not aware about what solutions are, existing behind the scenes, but there are some solutions to it, right? And sometimes it becomes very difficult for us to come up with a solution when we don't know, when we haven't, heard about anything that is similar to it. But when we are able to relate, these same concepts going forward into higher level applications, it doesn't matter whatever we are building. It could be a simple mobile application, it could be a simple web application, but whatever you are building, when you're able to relate these, concepts there, then it becomes a lot easier for you to develop these applications. And one thing that, I feel is a big takeaway from my course, is that it makes you curious, right? Because then, I mean, after going through this course, you would start understanding that each and everything in computer science has a reason behind it. It's not some magic that is happening right on the surface. It has some reason why it is working the way it is working, right? And when you know that there's a reason behind anything that you encounter in software development in your life, then it would make you very curious about the same stuff. Like you would start googling about, questions that come into your mind, and you would start asking a lot of questions going forward. Like even if you're learning Java, or if you're learning Python or JavaScript, or you're building some application, or you came across some open source repository online, and you saw, some functionality that is working, but now you got curious about how it is working behind the scenes, right? So it is going to provoke you to ask a lot of questions. It is going to make you curious, and it is going to improve your debugging skills like tenfold. So these are like some of the takeaways. And as for it being beginner friendly, then yes, I mean, it's very beginner friendly. I don't assume anything that you should know this, you should know that. The only thing that I assume is that you should have a Linux operating system, and for that also I've created a video.
Awesome, awesome. So we have three two tips, like it's a beginner friendly, and highlighting the point that Kubesimplify is working in the field of DevOps. It is helping folks to grow in the field of DevOps, and also this course, as been said by Apoorv, is helpful for the folks who are getting started with DevOps. So just you can check the links. All the relevant links are being tweeted in or commented in the above post. You just have to click on the pinned tweet and then see the comments. You will find all the relevant links. What is Kubesimplify, blogs, and playlists of. Now jumping on to the very basics. What difference do you see between Linux and other operating systems?
Well, first off, Linux is open source, it is free, right? So I mean, other operating system, Windows is owned by Microsoft, and Mac OS, it is owned by, it is developed for the Macintosh series for Apple, right? So it is open source. That's the very first thing. And the second, major thing that is there, like in favor of Windows, is that in favor of Linux, is that it's very secure. And why it is secure is something that again I've talked in my course, how it is so secure, because basically it has different, protection rings and access levels that restricts your access to, you know certain things that are there in terms of your hardware as well as software. So that is also there. And one more thing that is there is that most of the command line tools, that get developed in today's time, get developed keeping, Linux in mind, right? So most of the command line tools, CLI tools, or anything that are developed, they are primarily developed for Linux, and then they, move towards other operating systems like in Windows and Mac OS. So that is also there, but it's not like Linux doesn't have any disadvantages, right? So one disadvantage also I would like to talk about in Linux is that any hardware that you want to use, it might be that you got a nice keyboard with some RGB lights, or you got a new webcam or anything like that. So any of these new softwares that we talk about, sometimes they require some drivers to work with your system, right? And Linux can lack in there. I mean, sometimes there are not there are scenarios where drivers are not available for a particular hardware to be used with your system, or the drivers that are available are not going to use that hardware to its full potential. I mean, it could be that you got a nice RGB keyboard, but you cannot configure the RGB aspect of it in your Linux machine, right? So all of these things are there, and these drivers are then available, like easily available for Windows and Apple, because they are commercialized softwares, right? And any system that is not Apple gets sold with the Windows operating system by default, and all the Apple devices get sold with Mac OS as their default operating system, right? So the developers of these hardwares know the importance of creating drivers for Windows and Mac, but they like keep it as a third priority to develop these drivers for Linux operating system, right? So sometimes you won't find dedicated drivers available for different things that you want to do with your system, different hardwares that you want to use with your system. That is one disadvantage, one major disadvantage that is there for Linux. But apart from that, most of the things that we are talking about, like it being open source, again, it being open source has an exceptional community support, because when we talk about Windows operating system as a whole, then since it is a commercialized product, what happens is that their teams work, like they wait up to collect certain amount of bugs, after which they are going to start working on those bugs and roll out a new update or some patch which is going to fix those bugs, right? But that doesn't happens with Linux as such. In Linux, any bug that comes up, since it is open source, some developer somewhere out there is going to start working on it already. They they are going to basically fix that bug, get you know their code merged with the code base of Linux, and it is going to start working in the very next release itself, right? So the releases are faster in Linux because of this, and the bugs get resolved at a much higher pace. You can yourself resolve bugs if you have the like required knowledge right? You can yourself deep dive into the code and resolve your bugs, whatever bugs that might be coming in whatever distribution you're using. So yeah, I mean, these are like some of the few advantages and disadvantages of how Linux is different from other operating systems.
Um, no, couldn't agree more on this point. And I have a question from Siddhant in the comments. So, if you cannot turn or request as a speaker, please just comment in the pin to it. So the question is Mac versus Linux if budget is good. So I think if budget is good, you should definitely go for Mac, and let's hear it out from Apoorv.
Yeah, so that is like one of the reasons why I switched from Linux to Mac OS in my time, because I mean, once I like started making some money and I had the budget, then I definitely switched for Mac. Mac is basically Linux only, like somewhat Linux only. It's not exactly Linux, so that's not true. But since it is based out on FreeBSD, and FreeBSD is again Unix like, just like Linux is based out on Unix, right? So just because they both, the lineage is kind of similar and they both point towards Unix uh, in the history, then that is the reason why they are both very similar. And Mac offers a very good user experience on top of being similar to Linux, right? So the security might be not as good as Linux, but again, I mean, just because the user experience is awesome, and you know the UI UX is very awesome, and it makes very easier for you to work as a user on your system without losing out on anything, then definitely, I mean, Mac is the option that you should go for if you have the budget.
So I hope your question is answered, Siddhant. We have Bushra as a speaker. So Bushra,
Yeah, yeah. Hello, Apoorv. Hello, everyone.
Yeah,
Um,
hi.
uh, Thanks for joining, and it's been a pleasure listening you and getting interesting insights about Linux. So I'll be repeating Bhavya's question. I think she's having some network connectivity issues. So could you share some insights that why Linux is recommended for DevOps journey?
Okay, so like when we talk about DevOps, so DevOps is a field where most often than not you would be working on a Linux in a Linux environment only. I mean, most of the companies that are there, they set up their EC2 machines on some, some Linux distribution. It could be Ubuntu, it could be something else. And if let's say you work with Docker, then even in Docker, the base image that you get for your virtual machine that you're creating with Docker is going to be Linux based, right? So that is one of the main reasons. Because I mean, it's very easy to develop any application in Linux as compared to developing it or setting it up in a Windows machine or something like that, right? And most of the open source repositories that are there, all the readme.mds that they have, just to on how to set up that project in your system is going to be based out on how to set it up in a Linux system, right? Very less projects talk about how to set it up on Windows. Most of them are concerned about like Linux based operating systems only, because I mean, it's easier to set up a project in Linux, right? So that is one of the main reasons. Secondly, I mean, Linux has a very powerful, tool which is known as bash programming, right? So, I mean, since Linux by default uses the bash shell, and there are some other shells, that uses variants of bash, things like ZSH shell and fish shell and things like that. So there are these other shells as well, but by default it uses bash shell, bash programming shell. And all the commands that you're writing in your terminal are simply just bash programming. They are simply just written in the bash programming language. And using Linux, you become very familiar with how bash programming language works, and this bash scripts are something that you are going to use heavily in your DevOps endeavor as well. It could be that wanted to automate something. Maybe you wanted to automate um, running a simple server. Let's say you want to run a server, and that running the server has a set of 10 to 15 commands that it needs to execute, right? So it doesn't make sense to execute, write down all the 10 15 lines one by one and then your server starts up, right? You could simply create a bash file, right? Do some bash scripting and just write down all the commands in a single file, run that file, and your server is going to start running, right? So in those kind of scenarios, simplifying stuff for or clubbing different languages, different commands into a single file, so that you can just run it with a single command. um, all of those things become very easy with bash scripting, and these are the things that are going to help you in saving time as a DevOps engineer, right? These are the things that are going to make it beginner friendly for any developer who is joining your team, right? If let's say a new developer joins up your team sometime down the line, right, and you need to set up the entire project into their system, then for those purposes nowadays we have Docker, right? It's like you don't have to worry about how do I set this thing up in a Windows machine, right? You know that you have a Linux base image that is configured in your Docker, and you simply know that you just need to run a couple of commands to get that project started and running in any new system that is there, regardless of whatever operating system is installed, right? So that, like, these are one of the few reasons why Linux is good for uh, doing DevOps stuff, because most of the organizations, even the organizations that we talk about, the companies and organizations that are there, most of them operate by default on Linux only. And you know since as a DevOps engineer you are the one who are ensuring that it is easier to set up in all the new systems that you want to, and the process is as simple as it can be, right? Just a few commands or something like that, then it becomes very like im- important for you to understand how Linux works. It could be that you also you know want to set some different policies for different types of machines, right, or different types of users. And there are a lot of variables that involve around how you set up the entire infrastructure of an application as a DevOps engineer. So all of these variables that we're talking about, it could be something based on permission, something based on policies. Maybe some developer is going to have access to some things that the other developers might not, in terms of some environment variables that are set in their system, or some things like that. So all of these things, it becomes very easy for you to do these kind of things or play around with these kind of things when you're working on a Linux machine. And that's why, I mean, all the organizations prefer working on Linux machines than going for Windows and stuff, because as I mentioned earlier as well, um, all the command line tools also that get developed for Linux first, and then they focus on, like, move their priority towards developing them for Mac and Windows. Mac also gets developed pretty easily because it's more or less the same thing, and Bash works in Mac as well, right? So it's easier in that sense as well. But for Windows, it kind of takes a lot of time, right? So yeah, I mean, that is one of the reasons. Bash scripting is one of the major reasons why uh, you would need to learn Linux, because Bash scripting is something that is heavily used. Even if, like, let's say some of you are experienced in Docker, you would know, like, how important, like, how often or in what use cases can a Bash script be used to automate something or maybe simplify something, right? And then you also have some things available like cron jobs, right? If let's say you want to run a particular script every day at a particular time, or if you want to run some service every 1 hour or 2 hours, then you can easily configure it through a cron job, right? Instead of setting up the entire infrastructure around it, or maybe creating a lambda function on Linux, you can just simply create a cron job, and it's going to get things done for you, right? So in that sense also, I mean, it makes your life easier. I mean, as a DevOps engineer, knowing Linux makes your life a lot easier, because then, I mean, you would save a lot of your time, as well as you would save a lot of others time as well.
Yeah, so true. Thank you so much for the detailed explanation. We'll be loving Linux more from now on by getting your detailed explanations. Thank you.
Um, so I hope, Bushra, your question is answered completely. And we have another question from Siddhant. So he's asking that, is M1 chip Mac good for development as of now? So I can't say as of now, because I have been using M1 chip from last 1 year, and we have seen M2 chip being launched. So for me, I think the best system I have had for development till now is M1 chip. But let's hear it out from Apoorv, and other speakers, if they want to share their insights, that raise your hands, and I'll be just uh, giving you the time to speak on that.
Yeah, I think M1 is pretty stable as of now. I mean, it's um, they've made it in the sense that, and I think that it's a game changer in the industry, but they've developed M1 in the sense that now you don't have to create, write different code bases or maintain different code bases for having the same software work in a mobile and an iPad and and a MacBook or iWatch or whatever system is using M1, right? So that, I think, is a game changer, and I think it's pretty stable, because most of the softwares have already, moved to M1, and they work with M1. So it's a good option, I mean, to get started. And obviously, over the time, more and more things are going to, start becoming compatible with M1, and it's a good investment. I mean, the machine is very powerful. A lot of things work in it already, and the few things that still don't or are still struggling with some bugs or stuff, they are going to be improved soon. So it's going to be a good investment if you move to M1. I myself also have an M1 machine.
Awesome. So I think, Siddhant, your next question is also answered. So we have Arnav as a speaker. So Arnav, let's hear your question.
Yeah. So, hello everyone. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So hi Apoorv, and so I might be repeating it. So, but just to let everybody know, so anyone who is willing to go to get started with Linux or anything, Apoorv has a really nice video on how to get a Linux system on your machine installed, and even Kubesimplify has some logs on it. So you all can check it out once. And now moving on to my question, I have a question from you, Apoorv, that would you like to share with us some not so mainstream or general commands or tips that you use on a daily basis to increase productivity while working on Linux? Like something I use or go by on a daily basis is tmux, and using a multiplexed terminal is something that I find pretty useful while working on Linux. So, is there any tip or something that you know of that is not so mainstream that can help anyone in their lives or make their tasks easier or increase their productivity? Would you like to share something with us?
Yeah.
Before you start, I would like to add on this, and we would like to also, hear some fun question like, what is your best command, or like, what is your favorite command which you, love the most?
Okay. So yeah, so I'll just quickly share a couple of things. But before I do, one thing that Arnav mentioned was about my video. So I think Bhavya asked me earlier that the system is very like it performs very slow when you, let's say, dual boot your system. So in the end of the video that Arnav was talking about, I also like mentioned one blog, and I shared the link of that blog in the description, where you can install the Linux operating system in a pen drive instead of installing it in your hard disk. So that way, I mean, you don't have to worry about partitioning your system, which can be a petty task, right? And you won't be like worrying about any resource allocation, because if you're running it from a pen drive, then all the resources would be available to your operating system, right? Since it won't be running on a Windows. So that is something you can do. And coming back to the question, so there's this one thing that I generally do. I'm not sure if you guys are aware about it, but there is a file in your home which is known as bash profile, right? And this file is a hidden file, dot bash profile, right? And all the commands that are easily accessible, and you can basically create your own commands there, right? So what I usually do is, there are many a times where I want to quickly search if a particular keyword is available, in inside any file inside a directory, right? If, let's say, I wrote a React application and I want to see if this component that I'm exporting is getting imported anywhere in the project or not. So what I simply do is I create that command. I just simply wrote a bash program, right, which takes the string from me, takes the input from me, what input do I want to search, if it is anywhere mentioned in the file, inside any of the directory. And I input that, and it quickly uses the grep command with the hyphen IRL flags, which is to ignore uppercase, lowercase, and some other things that are there. It takes that, and it just searches and let me know what files have mentioned this particular keyword, right? So now this bash profile that I'm talking about, this bash profile can be used to create some aliases as well. So when I'm usually working, most of the times I'm working with a lot of EC2 machines that I want to SSH into, right? And remembering their you know IP addresses, there's elastic IP addresses. If, let's say, I've allocated an elastic IP to them, then remembering their IP address and their PEM files and stuff, what I do is I usually keep all the PEM files in one place only. uh, and I just create these aliases and the bash profile file. Right. I source the bash profile file after that. You could see, I mean, you could read more about the bash profile, but it can be a very handy file to create some, shortcuts, some aliases, or some commands that you heavily use. Right. I mean, there are things like you have multiple commands that you want to run one after the other. Right. So in those scenarios, I simply create an alias in the bash profile file, where I just write a smaller keyword like something like uh, RSD, right? And this is an example of Flask. So I simply create an RST command which runs three commands for me. It runs python manage.py recreate db. It then runs python manage.py seed db, and then it simply runs python manage.py run, right? So it it runs all these three commands, but I don't have to type these three commands like again and again. I simply create an RST command, an alias inside my bash profile. I source my bash profile. You have to do it only once. I mean, it's not like you have to do it again and again. You just source it once, and then it is going to, whenever you write rsd, it is going to create, like, write all the commands that you wanted to implement in place of that. And sometimes, you need some, things that you want to run in the startup. So that is again easy. I think I talked about it in one of my videos as well. There is a file known as init.d, which initializes, all the processes that should start in a startup, right? And it handles all the signals, as per the mother process, how the mother process would handle it, or how the init process will handle it. So I simply, run some programs in my init.d file that I want to start, during the startup and end when the system shuts down, right? So these are like two things that I use very frequently. The bash profile file, very handy again. And we're going to, like, I haven't mentioned this bash profile file in my videos yet, but later on when we move into, when I talk about, different DevOps things like Docker and stuff, then we are going to discuss about that. So I kept it for there. But yeah, I mean, these are my two, things that I work with very frequently. Bash profile is like one of my favorite files in Linux that helps me create shortcuts for anything. I can create, bash scripts that, run with simple commands anywhere in the system without worrying about where that file is located or stuff like that.
Okay, so this sounds really interesting. I'll explore it right away. Thank you for this. So that was it from my side. I had only this question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Arnav, for asking the question. And we have a few more folks joining us as a speaker. So I'll just go in the sequence. So Pratik was the first one. To Pratik, let's hear your question.
Hi everyone. So as for the question about why Linux is necessary for DevOps, I would like to add a point here. So while you will be learning about DevOps, you will come across terms like containers and stuff. So containers are like the basic building blocks which are enabling DevOps. So there are many Linux principles like namespaces and C groups which actually enable these containers. So we can say that DevOps is somewhat possible because of the flexibility Linux provides us of controlling how our system works. So yeah, that's a point which I wanted to add.
Thank you so much, Pratik. So Aryan, you have some questions? Just ask me.
Hello.
Yeah, you are audible.
Hey, I hope everyone's doing good today. So, Apoorv, I have a question for you. So I've been using WSL for a while, so I just wanted to know, I've been prolonging the switch to Linux for a while, so I wanted to know, does it really matter as to which Linux distribution, in terms of a developer's perspective, that we need to maybe stay away from, or that we need to maybe look after? For example, Ubuntu is the most user-friendly, but I know there are more, like there are other distributions that are user-friendly as well. But I just want to know in general which distributions do we stay away from, or yeah.
Yeah, so I guess Ubuntu is like one of the most common distributions that is used, and there are some other distributions that are like very, friendly, beginner friendly. Mint OS is very beginner friendly, and there are some other distributions as well. Now, one thing I would like to say for beginners, who are just starting out with Linux, is that don't worry about distributions as such, right? Because different distributions have different pros and cons, and they might follow, different file systems that are good for some things, not good for some other things, right? So I mean, all of these things are going to be there, but they, become more and more relevant with time and with experience. As beginners, it doesn't matter what distribution you use, as long as you're using some distribution of Linux, right? Because I mean, most of these distributions are good, or like they have some advantages and disadvantages on things that, you know, are something that are not relevant to you at a beginner phase, right? They are going to become relevant to you later on in time. And then I mean, when you're, you know, thinking about things like how should I, you know, have my system to use minimum resources and perform very well with those resources in this particular type of application, or in this particular type of use case, then in those scenarios it is going to become more relevant to you, like what file system should you have and what operating systems, what distribution should you have. But as beginners, it doesn't like uh, it doesn't make sense to be stuck with this point that what distribution is best. So for me personally, I haven't been able to like figure out what distribution is best for me, like even after being a Linux user for so many years, because to me all of them are mostly same based on my use case, right? Whatever I do in Linux, whatever I use Linux for, they all work the same way for me, right? I mean, the pros and cons that they have, I haven't encountered any pros and cons in my work that I do in Linux, right? So I mean, it doesn't make sense to get stuck with that question and you know, spend or waste, let's say, 1 week or 10 days around thinking what distribution is best or not, because most of them are going to work in the same way, right? And at beginner phase, it is important for you to learn first and then, you know, decide which one is good and which one is not, right? And in most of the cases, you know, all of these distributions are same, and whatever, no matter whatever use case you have, you are hardly ever going to encounter any problem with any of the distributions. But initially, as beginners, stay away from those distributions that don't have a GUI, such as, you know, there's Arch Linux and there's Kali Linux, which usually don't have a GUI. There are variants of these distributions as well that come with a GUI, but their GUI is then not that great, right? So go with distributions that have some GUI element to it, because then it is going to become extremely difficult for you. And you're going to be way out of your comfort zone if you go with something that doesn't have a GUI. But yeah, I mean, apart from that, uh, don't like spend time worrying about which distribution to choose. All of them are going to be same, and when they do start making a difference, you would have enough experience to decide on your own which one do you want to go with.
Thanks a lot, Apoorv.
Yeah, thank you, Arun, for asking the question. Before I jump on to the next speaker, Nitish, are you able to speak now? Okay, so he's experiencing problem. Um, so the next speaker is Jaddeep. Please ask your question.
Hey everyone, am I audible?
Yeah, you
Yeah,
are audible.
yeah, okay. So first of all, Apoorv, thank you for sharing that valuable information with all of us. It means a lot. So I have a question for you. Like, what is a booting process in Linux?
Uh, so booting process is it's basically the process with which your system boots. So I mean, it has 4 steps to it, and the first step is the BIOS itself. So I mean, nowadays BIOS has been replaced with UEFI, right? But it basically is the one that runs some system checks on you just to see if the hardware is working fine or not. Your memory is working fine. You have this space, and your, you know, drivers are plugged in and things like that. Your keyboard is connected or not, things like that. So it just basically checks some, you know, hardware things, the BIOS or the UEFI, right? And this BIOS or the UEFI that I'm talking about comes inside motherboard, right? The software is coming inside motherboard. So that's why you see that whatever motherboard or whatever company system you have, your UEFI interface is going to heavily depend or based out on that, and they might differ from what you might be seeing in any tutorials online or stuff like that, but they generally have the same thing. And it is also known as firmware, right? So firmware is this that is pre-installed in your motherboard. And then I mean, the main job of this is to run the system checks and start the bootloader in your system, right? So bootloader, in most of the cases, bootloader is the one which will be responsible for locating the kernel of your operating system. Where is the kernel? And it will initialize the kernel based on some kernel settings. So there are some configurations at the kernel level as well, right? Some configurations that you can read about online. Most of the times you won't be needing these configurations, but once the bootloader initializes the kernel, then the kernel has a very simple job. It just needs to initialize the mother process or the init process, and then it just needs to manage all the processes like resource allocation between different processes and things like that. And the init process or the mother process that is there, which is the fourth step of the boot process, it is responsible for starting all the daemon processes. And these daemon processes, are the ones that are running your system. Whatever things you have in your system, some networking ports that you have opened or closed for interacting with the internet, or the GUI of your system. If let's say you have an NVIDIA graphics card, then running the NVIDIA drivers to just to make sure that the GUI is loading up in your system, and all the essential things that are there in your system are going to be handled by the mother process. And then it just keeps going on. These processes clone themselves, and known as parents and child processes, and then things keep going on like that. So the four steps that we talk about: the BIOS or the firmware or the UEFI, and then the bootloader. Then from bootloader, the kernel starts up. From kernel starts up the mother process, and then your system starts running. So this is usually the boot process of any system.
Okay, thank you, Apoorv.
Uh, Thank you, Jadi, for joining as a speaker and asking a question. Before we jump to the next speaker, I'd like to repeat this thing again, that we have a pinned tweet on the space. If you are joined with your computer and not on the smartphones, you can ask your question by commenting on the tweet. I'll be just asking it directly from Apoorv. Um, and yeah, jumping on to the next speaker, it is Krish. Please ask a question.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
So first of all, thank you, Ayush, for inviting me to ask my question. And then thank you, Apoorv, a lot for bringing up this space and making this space possible, because it was really knowledgeable and informational for me, and I learned a lot of new concepts. So really thank you. And so my question is that how does the WSL thing and using a complete Linux system differ? I've used WSL too and a Linux system in a dual boot, but I think that WSL is much more better if I don't want to use the Linux UI.
Okay, so one of the major differences again that we talked about earlier is that WSL comes only with the CLI component of your Linux operating system, right? It doesn't have a GUI component to it. So there are some, softwares in Linux that are GUI based, things like gedit, and there are some other things as well. Maybe if you want to control the partitioning of your system through gparted or utility disk or something like that, then all of those softwares are not going to work with WSL. And WSL is, again, it is good. It's not like it's not good or anything, but the main thing is that when we talk about WSL doesn't locks your resources in your system, right? It doesn't locks a certain amount of hard disk for running your Linux operating system. It doesn't locks a certain amount of memory for running your operating system, right? But virtual machine does that on the other hand, right? So WSL is more like just to emulate a Linux based operating system in your machine, which like with time would have a lot of how do I say this, would have a lot of limitations, right? And you won't be able to utilize the full operating system at its full capacity, right? Things would still be running as Linux behind the scenes, would still be running as Windows behind the scenes, right? And it's just going to like create a wrapper around uh, the Windows and the Linux, a Linux wrapper inside of Windows, right? So in that sense, I mean, WSL is good if you just want to learn but don't want to use, Linux as an operating system, right? So if your only sole purpose is just to learn Linux but not use it, not actually use it, then WSL can be a very good option, because then you don't have to, worry about all the resources that you are allocating to your virtual machine and things. But if, let's say, you want to use it, like use the operating system, then you should definitely go for dual boot, or use a virtual machine. Dual boot can be complicated. I mean, dual boot, I understand that it's complicated because you have to worry about partitioning. And if, let's say, you partitioned your hard disk initially and you didn't leave any free space, or you didn't create, 2 3 partitions for disk C, disk D, and disk E, things like that in your system, then it can be very complicated to free up space for creating another partition later on in time, right? That is a very complicated process. And because of that, I mean, a lot of people also face issues in dual booting their system. So the initial process can be complicated to dual boot, but if you want to use Linux as the sole operating system, then you should definitely like go with dual boot. If you're only using it to practice Linux, then I think WSL is a very good option. I mean, it will save you all the hassle of doing partitioning and stuff, and still you would be able to learn Linux inside Windows only.
That really answered a lot of my questions, but I'm not sure that how many people here use Windows 11. But with Windows 11 and WSL 2, you can actually access GUI apps of Linux in your PC directly. And I found a tutorial on how to make your Linux, the WSL thing, go onto another drive that you can allocate the resources.
Yeah, I mean, see, the GUI applications that are there can also be ran through WSL. I think there are some driver installations that you need to do. They're mentioned in the official documentation of WSL2. I haven't given it a try because, I mean, my mode of using like Linux is simply dual booting my system. And I also tried virtual machine, but then again, I mean, I wasn't satisfied with it. Uh, Only because, I mean, I know how dual boot works, and it was not that difficult for me to do. I'm not sure exactly how the Windows 11 and WSL works, or if you can allocate some resources to WSL, because then it kind of makes it a virtual machine only. But yeah, I mean, if that's an option, then that is new to me, and definitely looks interesting. But again, I'm not sure. I mean, based on how it works behind the scenes, WSL.
Krish, I hope your question is answered, or you have something else to know.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really good definition of it. Approved. I will try all three of them, virtual machines will do, and WSL, and then come up with the opinion rather than just saying or just thinking that WSL is the best one because I don't have to switch between operating systems.
I think for me, I mean, the best approach is to uninstall Windows and install Ubuntu or some other operating system. I mean, Windows actually doesn't have any use case unless you want to play video games or stuff. That can definitely not be done in Linux machine. But yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, I would prefer uninstalling Windows and installing Linux only in my system.
Any more question, Krish? uh,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
just
I want to ask.
yeah, Rohit, you can just ask the question.
Means, do you know any website which provide free Linux playgrounds where I can practice Linux for free? Means I don't want to install anything. Directly I want to practice.
There are a lot of labs that are there that provide this thing that you're talking about. So I mean, all the cyber security platforms that are there, they provide these, virtual playgrounds and virtual machines that you can directly access and start using them. I will share some links in the tweet that is created. I'll have to see. But there are a lot of them. I mean, there are a lot of places where you can directly access the playgrounds.
You can set the link in Discord. Okay.
Yeah, I'll share it both places in the thread, the tweet that Kubesimplify has created, and the Discord server.
And when is your self scripting video will come?
Uh, Not soon.
Okay.
Uh,
Uh,
so, so can I speak for a second just to answer Rohit's question? There is a website named COCALC, CoCalc. I have used it several times. It provides an online Linux environment to practice the command, so you can just check it out. I'll put it up in the comments as well.
Okay, I will check.
I also want to add to Rohit's question. There's a website called Devops, which is cloud dev environment. So you can open up any Git repository and work on it on a Linux operating system because it's based off Linux.
Yeah, you can send the link in my message.
Um, that is a great question, Rohit, and thank you for sharing your insights, Krish and Arnab. Um, okay, then I see the questions are, all the questions are answered, and thank you for tuning in, everyone. We will be doing more such Twitter Spaces in future with more speakers, and definitely we'll get Apoorv as well if we get an interesting topic which Apoorv would like to join as a speaker. Just you know just see the pin tweets in the Cube Simplify. Follow Cube Simplify for more such interesting blogs, videos, and more such projects. You can also join in the Discord server. It will be linked in the pin tweet. Do follow Apoorv's course on YouTube, which is already pinned in the uh, pinned tweet. Thank you so much. Thank you so
Yeah,
much, Apoorv,
thank
for
you.
joining in. Any ending regards if you have them, you can share.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks everyone for joining. Have a nice day. Have a good night.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and yeah,